The sound of his wife's voice, filtered through the solid oak of the bedroom door, was a silken thread of poison. Ethan stood in the dim hallway, the plush runner muffling his stockinged feet, his body perfectly still. He had not meant to eavesdrop. He had been coming to tell her he'd made a pot of her favorite chamomile tea, a small gesture of comfort on a day he had deliberately shattered. But the words he caught suspended him in a state of chilling clarity, the world narrowing to the space between his ear and the door. "Of course he's a wreck, Mother," Chloe was saying. Her tone was not one of sympathy. It was one of exasperation, of inconvenience. It was the tone one might use to describe a broken appliance. "He's been moping around the house all afternoon like a lost puppy. I swear I've never seen a grown man look so pathetic." A pause. Ethan could imagine his mother-in-law, Eleanor, on the other end of the line, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the screen of her phone, her lips pursed in a familiar expression of distaste. "No, I don't think he has a plan," Chloe continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried through the wood with perfect, devastating precision. What plan could he possibly have? He was a mid-level architectural consultant. It's not like he was some kind of titan of industry. He's average. We always knew that. We always knew that. The words echoed in the silent spaces of Ethan's heart. He had told her he'd lost his job less than 6 hours ago. He had delivered the news with a carefully crafted performance of shame and fear. His shoulders slumped, his voice thick with feigned despair. He had looked into her wide, beautiful eyes and said the words that were meant to be a test, a final, desperate probe into the foundations of their 5-year marriage. "They're downsizing," he had mumbled, unable to meet her gaze. "My position has been eliminated." Her reaction had been flawless. She had rushed to him, her arms wrapping around his neck. "Oh, Ethan, darling, no. We'll be okay. We'll get through this. I'm here. We're a team." Her embrace had felt like absolution. For a fleeting, hopeful moment, he had allowed himself to believe. He had chastised himself for his cynicism, for orchestrating this cruel little test in the first place. He had held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her expensive perfume, and thought, "She means it. I was wrong. She loves me." Now, standing outside the door, the memory of that embrace felt like a phantom limb, an ache for something that had never truly been there. The woman who had held him was gone, replaced by this cold strategist on the phone with her mother. "Honestly, I'm thinking this might be a blessing in disguise," Chloe said, and this was the sentence that broke him. It wasn't a crack, it was a seismic fracture, splitting him open from top to bottom. "I mean, it's going to be a nightmare for a few months, obviously, the embarrassment of it all. But maybe this is the push I needed. You always said I settled, Mother. You said I could have done so much better." A longer pause. Eleanor was likely delivering a triumphant, "I told you so." I know," Chloe sighed. "But he was so decent, so earnest. I thought that would be enough. But decent doesn't pay for a trip to Monaco, does it? Decent doesn't get you a table at the Grove. It just gets you this, a quiet little life in a house that's suddenly too big for a man with no income." Ethan felt a strange calmness descend over him, the cold, clear-eyed serenity that follows a devastating impact. The pain was immense, a white-hot nova in his chest, but it was also clarifying. The fog of hope had been burned away. He was not a husband to the woman in that room. He was a line item on a balance sheet that had just turned red. He was an investment that had failed to mature. He looked down at his hand. He had been holding a small, worn leather portfolio, a slim case he carried with him everywhere. It contained his life's real work. Not the modest consultancy he presented to the world, but the silent, sprawling empire he had built from nothing. Inside that portfolio was the truth, a truth he had guarded for years, waiting for the right moment to share it, a moment of perfect trust that he now knew would never arrive. Chloe thought he was pathetic. Her mother thought he was a failure. They believed their judgment was absolute, their position unassailable. What they didn't know was that their entire world, the designer clothes, the exclusive club memberships, the casual arrogance of the truly wealthy, was a stage he had built and paid for, and he was about to bring down the curtain. This was the moment of truth, a story of love and lies, of status and substance. It's a situation many of us fear, the discovery that the person sleeping next to you doesn't truly see you at all. We hope you'll stick with us to see how this unfolds. If you enjoy stories about hidden strength and seeing arrogance get its just desserts, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to Ethan and the night that changed everything. He backed away from the door, his movements as silent as a ghost. He returned to the kitchen, the scent of chamomile now seeming sickly and sweet. He poured the tea down the drain. The warmth was gone. The test was over. The results were in. And as he stood there in the gleaming, state-of-the-art kitchen that Chloe had so proudly shown off to her friends, a kitchen he had designed and funded, he began, methodically and with chilling precision, to make a plan. Not a plan to survive, a plan to reveal. The foundation of their life together had been built on a lie, but not his. The lie was theirs. The lie was that status was interchangeable with worth, that his value was measured by the job title he offered them, a title he had intentionally chosen for its modesty. He had met Chloe at a gallery opening. He was there to consult on the lighting for a new wing, a small pro bono project he'd taken on for a friend. She was there because it was the place to be seen. She had mistaken him for one of the artists, someone brilliant but likely penniless. When he told her he was an architectural consultant, a flicker of something, disappointment, crossed her face before being replaced by a dazzling smile. "How fascinating," she'd said. "You shape the world we live in." He fell for the poetry of it, for her. She was beautiful, vibrant, and seemed utterly captivated by his quiet passion for form and function. He spoke of buildings as living things, of spaces that could elevate the human spirit. She listened, her head tilted, her eyes alight with what he mistook for genuine interest. He didn't talk about money or his firm, Helios Designs. He just said he worked as a consultant. It was an omission, a small piece of himself he held back. He had seen how people changed when they learned the scale of his success. He wanted, for once, to be seen for himself. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Within a year, they were engaged. It was then that he met Eleanor and Robert, Chloe's parents, for the first time. The meeting took place at their sprawling estate in Greenwich, a monstrosity of neoclassical architecture that Ethan found both ostentatious and structurally unsound. Eleanor, thin and brittle as a bird, had appraised him over the rim of a crystal glass filled with champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Chloe tells us you're in architecture, Ethan," she had said, her voice dripping with condescension. "A noble profession, though not a particularly lucrative one these days, is it?" Robert, a portly man whose presence was largely atmospheric, had simply grunted in agreement, his attention fixed on a slice of pâté. "I do well enough," Ethan had replied calmly, meeting her gaze. "Well enough is a wonderfully relative term, isn't it?" Eleanor had smiled, a tight, unpleasant stretching of her lips. "Chloe is used to a certain standard of living. We've always encouraged her to aim high. Her ex-boyfriend, Julian, the investment banker, he was on track to make partner by 30. Such a shame they broke up." Chloe, sitting beside him, had squeezed his hand. "Mother, please," she'd said, but her protest was weightless, a feather against a gale. She didn't defend him. She managed her mother. It was a pattern that would define the next 5 years. Every cutting remark from Eleanor, every passive-aggressive slight, was followed by Chloe's placating whisper, "She doesn't mean it, darling. It's just her way." During the wedding planning, his opinions were systematically discarded. He, an award-winning architect, had tried to offer suggestions for the venue. Eleanor had waved a dismissive hand. "Leave it to us, Ethan. We know the right people. You wouldn't be familiar with these venues." He had wanted a simple, elegant ceremony. They had insisted on a gaudy, over-the-top affair with a guest list comprised almost entirely of their own business associates and social rivals. He was a prop in his own wedding, the quiet, unassuming husband meant to stand beside their dazzling daughter. He had paid for it all, the entire lavish event. He did it through a separate account, telling Chloe it was a modest inheritance from his grandparents. The lie felt necessary, a shield. He transferred the seven-figure sum to cover the costs, and Eleanor never once questioned where the money for her extravagant taste was coming from. She simply assumed it was her due. She saw his compliance as weakness, his quiet generosity as the desperate act of a man punching above his weight, lucky to be admitted into their gilded world. He bought them a house, a beautiful modern structure of glass and cedar he designed himself, nestled in a quiet wooded suburb. It was his masterpiece, a sanctuary of light and peace. He put the deed in both their names, a gesture of trust. Chloe loved it, but mostly for the prestige it conferred. She spoke of its market value, not its soul. Eleanor had visited once, walking through the soaring, sunlit spaces with a critical eye. "It's very minimalist," she had declared, as if it were a disease. "A bit cold, don't you think? It lacks the warmth of a family home." Then she had turned to Chloe, and in a stage whisper Ethan was clearly meant to hear, said, "Don't worry, darling. We can have a proper decorator come in and fix it." Through it all, Ethan remained patient. He believed, or wanted to believe, that Chloe's love was a separate entity from her family's suffocating snobbery. He thought that in the quiet moments they shared, away from her mother's influence, they had something real. He held on to the memory of the woman who had seemed so fascinated by the poetry of his work, hoping she was still in there, buried beneath layers of acquired materialism. His test, the lie about his job, was a final attempt to excavate that woman, to see if, when the chips were down and the status was stripped away, she would stand with him. The phone call was his answer. The woman he loved didn't exist. She had been an illusion, a role she played as long as he was providing the life she wanted. And now that he was no longer useful, the performance was over. Standing in the kitchen, the silence of the large house pressed in on him. It was no longer a home, it was a set. A beautifully designed, very expensive stage for a play that had just reached its tragic, farcical conclusion. He picked up his phone and sent a short, encrypted text to Marcus, his lawyer and oldest friend. "The contingency is in play. I need you to draw up the papers, all of them." Marcus's reply was instantaneous. "Consider it done. Are you okay?" Ethan looked around the perfect, soulless kitchen. "I will be," he typed back. The words felt truer than anything he had said all day. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache. But beneath it, something else was stirring. Not a desire for petty revenge, but a need for the clean, satisfying clarity of truth. He had lived a quiet life, hiding his strength. That was over. The storm was coming, and for the first time, he was not going to seek shelter. He was going to be the storm. 2 weeks later, the humiliation came, as Ethan knew it would, gift-wrapped in a dinner invitation. Eleanor had called, her voice a syrupy blend of false sympathy and morbid curiosity. "We thought we should have a little family dinner," she'd announced. "Just us, to talk things over, support you and Chloe in this difficult time." Ethan agreed without hesitation, his voice a perfect imitation of a defeated man. "That's very kind of you, Eleanor. Thank you." He could almost hear her preening through the phone. She was gathering her court to pass judgment on the fallen. He was to be the evening's entertainment. When they arrived at the Greenwich estate, the air was already thick with condescension. Robert greeted them at the door with a limp handshake for Ethan, and a dramatic, sorrowful hug for his daughter. "Chloe, my poor girl, you're being so brave," he murmured, loud enough for Ethan to hear every word. Eleanor swept in, dressed in a severe black dress that made her look like a chic, judgmental raven. She kissed the air near Chloe's cheek and gave Ethan a look one might reserve for a piece of furniture that was scheduled to be thrown out. "Ethan," she said, her voice flat, "good of you to come. I hope you're holding up." The words were a formality. Her eyes said she hoped he wasn't. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The dining room, with its cavernous ceiling and a table long enough to land a small aircraft on, felt like an arena. Ethan was seated at the far end, opposite Robert, effectively isolating him. Chloe was placed between her parents, a princess being protected from the destitute commoner. The topic, of course, was Ethan's unemployment. Eleanor steered the conversation with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. "I've been making some calls, you know," she began, delicately cutting into her filet mignon. "For Chloe's sake. I spoke to a friend of ours on the board of the museum. There might be a fundraising position opening up. It would be good for her to have something of her own, now more than ever, to keep her occupied." The implication was clear. Chloe needed to secure her own lifeboat now that Ethan's ship had sunk. Chloe, to her credit, looked uncomfortable. "Mother, that's not necessary right now. We're still figuring things out." "Nonsense, darling," Robert boomed, chiming in for the first time. "Your mother is being proactive. In times of crisis, one must be decisive. Can't sit around waiting for things to happen. Isn't that right, Ethan?" He looked down the table, a smug glint in his eye. Ethan met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Decisiveness is certainly a virtue, Robert." He took a slow sip of water. His calmness was beginning to unnerve them. They had expected a broken man, a man desperate for their help. They were getting a statue. Inside his jacket, his fingers brushed against the smooth leather of his portfolio. It was his anchor in this sea of contempt. It contained the blueprints of their downfall, the silent, irrefutable truth of his life. He didn't need to say a word yet. He just needed to endure, to let them build their case against him, to let them reveal the full, ugly scope of their characters. Every insult was another brick in the wall they were building around themselves. Eleanor, frustrated by his composure, escalated her attack. "You know, Ethan, I was talking to Julian the other day." She dropped the name of Chloe's ex-boyfriend like a stone into a still pond. "He's just bought a summer home in the Hamptons, a lovely place right on the water. He was asking after you, Chloe." Chloe shifted in her seat. "Mother, what does Julian have to do with anything?" "I'm just making a point about stability, dear," Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "Some men build empires. They have drive. They have a safety net. Others, well, others consult." The final word was delivered with a sneer, as if it were the foulest of insults. Ethan placed his fork and knife down on his plate, the silver making a quiet, definitive click against the porcelain. He looked from Eleanor to Robert, then to Chloe, who refused to meet his eyes. She was staring at her plate, her silence a roaring confession of her allegiance. "An empire can be a fragile thing, Eleanor," Ethan said, his voice quiet but carrying across the vast table. "It can be built on sand, on speculation, on the perception of value rather than its substance. Sometimes the strongest structures are the ones you don't see, the ones with foundations sunk deep into the bedrock." Eleanor let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, spare us the philosophical metaphors, Ethan. It's a bit much, coming from a man who was just let go from his consulting job. Bedrock doesn't pay the bills." "You're right," Ethan said, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "It doesn't. Revenue does. Assets do. Ownership does." He picked up his glass of wine, a deep, rich Cabernet he knew cost over $1,000 a bottle. He had supplied it for their cellar last Christmas, a gift they had accepted without question or proper thanks. He swirled the liquid, watching the legs crawl down the side of the glass. "This is an excellent vintage," he noted, changing the subject so abruptly it gave them all whiplash. A 2005 Screaming Eagle, a very wise investment for whoever bought it. Robert grunted. I picked it up at auction. Know a good thing when I see it. It was a lie. Ethan knew for a fact Robert's wine knowledge was limited to red or white. Ethan simply nodded, taking another sip. He let the lie hang in the air, another piece of evidence. He was cataloging everything. The list of grievances was growing longer, more detailed. The quiet before the storm was almost over. He could feel the pressure building, the static in the air. They thought they were winning, that they were breaking him down with their casual cruelty. They didn't understand. They weren't breaking him. They were freeing him. With every insult, every dismissive glance, the last vestiges of his love for Chloe, of his tolerance for them, were being burned away, leaving behind something hard and pure. Resolve. After dinner, as they moved to the drawing room for coffee, Eleanor delivered what she thought was the final, crushing blow. Chloe, darling, she said, putting an arm around her daughter's shoulder and physically steering her away from Ethan. Robert and I have been talking. We think it would be best if you came to stay with us for a while, just until things are more stable. You need a supportive environment, not one filled with stress and uncertainty. It was an eviction notice disguised as an offer of sanctuary. They were extracting their daughter from her marriage, right in front of him. Ethan watched them, his face impassive. Chloe looked back at him, her expression a miserable mix of guilt and relief. She was going to go. He knew it. She was going to abandon him in the house he had built for them, retreating to the safety of her parents' wealth and prejudice. That sounds like a good idea, Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. Just for a little while. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand, he said. And he did. He understood everything perfectly. He reached into his jacket and his fingers closed around the leather portfolio. The time for listening was over. The time for speaking was about to begin. The days following the dinner at Eleanor's were a study in calculated silence. Chloe moved a few of her things to her parents' house, framing it as a temporary measure. Just to give us some space to think, Ethan, she'd said, avoiding his eyes as she packed a designer suitcase with clothes he had bought her. It's all been so stressful. Ethan played his part with chilling perfection. He was the picture of a man adrift, wandering through the large, empty rooms of his own home. He'd let calls from concerned friends of Chloe's go to voicemail. He'd spend hours in his home office, the door closed, leading her to believe he was fruitlessly scouring job sites. In reality, his office had become a war room. The large drafting table, usually covered in architectural plans, was now neatly organized with financial statements, legal documents, and corporate ownership charts. His phone calls were not to headhunters, but to Marcus, his lawyer, and the board of Helios Designs. He had overheard more conversations. Chloe, feeling secure at her parents' estate, had grown bolder, less discreet. He had called her, using the pretext of asking about a piece of mail, and had heard Eleanor's voice clearly in the background. The lawyer says that since his name is on the deed too, it complicates things, Eleanor was saying, her voice sharp with annoyance. But if he's got no income, a judge will see that selling the house is the only logical step. We just have to pressure him, make him see it's his only option to get some liquidity. Chloe had shushed her mother, but the damage was done. They weren't just planning her exit from the marriage. They were plotting to seize his assets. They were trying to force the sale of the home he had designed and built with his own hands, the one tangible symbol of the life he had tried to create. Their audacity was breathtaking. They saw him as so utterly defeated, so powerless, that they believed they could simply take what was his. This was the final piece of confirmation he needed. His plan had been one of revelation, of truth-telling. Now it became one of absolute, unassailable defense and the cold, hard process of reclamation. He met Marcus for lunch at a quiet, discreet restaurant in the city. Marcus, a man whose sharp suits and sharper intellect had been Ethan's secret weapon for over a decade, slid a thick folder across the table. It's all here, Marcus said, his voice low. Divorce petitions. A full accounting of your premarital assets, which by the way is 99.9% of your total assets. A restraining order against Eleanor and Robert for harassment and conspiracy to commit fraud, should you need it. And the complete Helios Designs portfolio, including the final valuation from the acquisition deal. Ethan opened the folder. The pages were filled with the cold, hard numbers that represented his life's work. The quiet hours, the sleepless nights, the risks he'd taken, the empire he'd built while the world, including his own wife, saw him as a simple, mid-level functionary. She thinks they can force a sale of the house, Ethan said, his voice devoid of emotion. Marcus snorted. Let them try. The house was paid for in full from a trust account you established 5 years before you even met her. The trust is the legal owner. Your names are on the deed as residents with rights of survivorship, not as equity partners. They have no claim. Their lawyer is either incompetent or he's just telling them what they want to hear. Ethan nodded, a grim sense of satisfaction settling in. He had always been a man who believed in solid foundations. He had built his life and his business with the same meticulous care he put into his architectural designs. He had accounted for every contingency, including the catastrophic failure of his own marriage. What about the company? Ethan asked. The sale of the majority stake to Omnicorp is complete, Marcus confirmed. The funds have been transferred to your holding company in Switzerland. Your net worth is now, for lack of a better term, stratospheric. You've retained a 20% stake and a permanent seat on the board as chief design officer for the global firm. So technically, you haven't lost your job. You've just been promoted to the highest echelons of your field. The irony was so thick Ethan could taste it. He was, at this very moment, one of the most powerful figures in his industry, and his wife and her family were plotting how to get their hands on what they perceived as his only remaining asset, a house they didn't even own. Their arrogance is their weakness, Marcus said, echoing a sentiment they had shared many times over the years. They can't see past the surface. They never could. I know, Ethan said. He closed the folder. It's time to schedule the final meeting. I'll call them this afternoon. I'll tell them I want to discuss their offer for Chloe to stay with them. I'll say I want to talk about our options, about selling the house. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You're going to bait the trap. They've been circling for weeks, Ethan replied, his eyes cold and clear. It's time to let them step into it. He drove home, the leather folder resting on the passenger seat beside him. He passed parks where families were playing, couples were walking hand in hand. For a moment, a wave of profound sadness washed over him. He had wanted that. A real partnership, a life of shared joys and struggles. He had been willing to give everything for it. But the person he had chosen to build that life with had been more interested in the facade than the foundation. When he got home, he walked through the silent rooms. He saw the expensive vase Eleanor had given them as a housewarming gift, the coffee table book on Great Dynasties of American Wealth that Robert had presented to him with a patronizing pat on the back. He saw the dozens of small, cutting reminders of their relentless judgment. He picked up his phone and dialed Chloe's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice wary. Ethan, is everything okay? I'm fine, he said, his tone one of weary resignation. Listen, I've been thinking about what your mother said, about you staying there, about the house. I think we need to talk, all of us. Your parents have been very involved, and I think it's only right we discuss this as a group. Can you all come over tomorrow evening? We can figure out the next steps together. There was a pause on the other end, and he could hear her muffled voice speaking to her mother. He wants to talk. He sounds ready to give in. Then Chloe's voice came back on the line, brighter now, laced with triumph. Of course, Ethan. We'll be there. 7 o'clock? 7 is perfect, he said and hung up the phone. He stood in the center of the vast living room, the late afternoon sun slanting through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floors. The house was quiet. It was the quiet of a stage waiting for the final act to begin, the quiet before the storm. And tomorrow the storm would arrive, and it would bear his name. The air in the living room was thick enough to chew. It was 7:15, and for the past 15 minutes, Ethan had done nothing but serve his guests. He had offered them drinks, sparkling water for Eleanor, who never drank before a negotiation, a heavy-handed scotch for Robert, and a glass of crisp Sauvignon Blanc for Chloe. He himself drank nothing. They had arranged themselves on the sleek, minimalist furniture like a tribunal. Eleanor and Robert sat side by side on the large sofa, a united front of condescending power. Chloe perched nervously on the edge of an armchair, casting worried glances between him and her parents. She was a pawn, and she was beginning to look like she regretted her position on the board. Ethan had let the silence stretch. It was a tactic he'd learned in high-stakes business deals. The person who speaks first often concedes the most. He let them sit in the quiet of his house, a quiet that was usually filled with music or conversation, and feel its weight. He watched as Robert shifted uncomfortably, as Eleanor's polite smile became strained at the edges. Finally, Eleanor could bear it no longer. "Well, Ethan," she began, her voice overly bright, "thank you for inviting us over. I know this is difficult, but it's for the best that we handle this like adults." "Yes," Robert added, swirling his scotch. "Time to face facts. The situation is what it is." Ethan, who had been standing by the window looking out at the darkening woods, turned to face them. He was not wearing a suit, but a simple, well-fitted cashmere sweater and dark trousers. He looked relaxed, at ease, which was the most unsettling thing of all. On his hip, almost like a gunslinger's pistol, was the slim leather portfolio. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice calm and measured. It carried easily in the acoustically perfect room. "I agree, it is time to face facts." He walked slowly to the center of the room, not sitting, but commanding the space. He was no longer the moping, defeated man they had been dealing with for weeks. There was a new energy about him, an unnerving stillness. "I asked you here because you have all been so involved in my marriage to Chloe, in our lives. You've offered so much advice, shown so much concern. I felt it was only right that you be present for the final decisions." Eleanor's smile widened. This was it, the capitulation she had been waiting for. "A very sensible approach, Ethan. We are here to help Chloe in any way we can." "I'm sure you are," Ethan said, his eyes locking onto hers. "But before we discuss the future, I think it's important to fully understand the past, to have a clear accounting of how we arrived at this moment." He began to pace slowly, his footsteps soft on the polished floor. "We've been married for 5 years, Chloe, and for 5 years I have been welcomed into your family." He paused. "Or at least, I have been present at family gatherings." The correction was subtle, but it landed. Chloe flinched. "From the very beginning," Ethan continued, his gaze shifting to Eleanor, "you made your assessment of me perfectly clear. I was not what you had hoped for. I was, in your words, decent, a simple man, a man Chloe was settling for." Eleanor's face tightened. "I may have been concerned, yes. Any mother would be." "Concerned?" Ethan's voice was still quiet, but it had a new edge, as sharp as glass. "Is that what you call it? Do you remember our first meeting, Eleanor? You openly mourned Chloe's breakup with Julian, the banker. You implied my profession was a step down. At our wedding, a wedding I paid for in its entirety, you told your friends you hoped Chloe wouldn't have to get used to a simpler life. You have spent 5 years systematically undermining my position in my own home, in my own marriage. You have treated me not as a son-in-law, but as a temporary inconvenience you were certain your daughter would eventually discard." He stopped pacing and stood directly in front of her. "You were not concerned, Eleanor. You were contemptuous. There's a difference." The room was utterly silent. Robert's hand holding his glass was frozen halfway to his lips. Ethan then turned his attention to Robert. And you have been the chorus to her symphony of disdain. Every sneer, every backhanded compliment, you have been there to echo it. At the dinner 2 weeks ago, you told me a man must be decisive in a crisis. You presumed to lecture me on financial stability, all while drinking wine that I bought for your cellar, in a house that I built. Robert sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. Now see here, there's no need for this kind of talk. There is every need, Ethan said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more intense. Because you are about to try and give me more of your advice. You are here tonight because you believe I am broken, unemployed, and desperate. You have come to this house to orchestrate its sale from under me and to escort your daughter away from the wreckage of my life. Am I wrong? No one answered. The truth of his accusation was so stark, so precise, that it left no room for denial. Finally, he turned to Chloe. His expression softened, but it was the softness of profound disappointment, of a love that had died and was now being autopsied. And you, Chloe, he said, his voice laced with a sorrow that was more damning than any anger. You stood by and let it all happen. Every insult, every slight. Your only defense was to tell me, that's just how they are. You taught me that your parents' approval was more important than my dignity. You taught me that our marriage was conditional. And when the condition appeared to be violated, when the money seemed to be gone, you didn't hesitate. He took a step closer to her. I heard you on the phone with your mother, Chloe. The night I told you I lost my job. I heard you call me pathetic. I heard you say this was a blessing in disguise. I heard you confirm that you had settled for me. You didn't defend me. You didn't stand with me. You started planning your exit before my chair was even cold. Chloe's face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes. Ethan, no, you don't understand. I was just upset. I was scared. Were you scared? Ethan asked, his voice gentle but relentless. Or were you relieved? Relieved that you finally had an excuse to do what your mother always wanted you to do, to find someone better. He let the question hang in the air, a final, terrible indictment. The foundation of their lies had been exposed, the rot laid bare. The room was no longer a living room but a courtroom, and he had just delivered his opening statement. Now it was time to present the evidence. You came here tonight to talk about my finances, my lack of income, and the need to sell this house, Ethan said, his voice shifting from emotional reckoning to cold, hard business. So let's talk about it. He unzipped the leather portfolio. The sound was unnervingly loud in the silent room. Eleanor and Robert leaned forward, their faces a mixture of apprehension and greedy anticipation. They thought he was about to produce bank statements showing his dwindling savings, proof that he was at their mercy. Instead, Ethan pulled out a single, beautifully rendered architectural drawing. It was a conceptual design for a breathtaking skyscraper, a twisting tower of glass and greenery that seemed to defy gravity. He laid it on the polished surface of the coffee table. This is the Helios Tower, Ethan said calmly, the new European headquarters for Omnicorp in London. My firm, Helios Designs, won the contract 6 months ago. It's the most ambitious architectural project in the city for a generation. Eleanor stared at the drawing, nonplussed. Your firm? I thought you were a consultant, a salaried employee. That is what I allowed you to believe, Ethan said, his eyes glinting with a cold fire. He reached back into the portfolio and pulled out a sheaf of papers, bound in a neat clip. He placed it on the table next to the drawing. This is the Articles of Incorporation for Helios Designs, LLC, established 12 years ago. As you can see, the founder, president, and sole shareholder is Ethan Crane. He paused to let the words sink in. Chloe's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face a mask of utter confusion. Robert squinted at the papers as if trying to decipher a foreign language. I was never a mid-level consultant, Eleanor, Ethan continued, his voice as smooth and hard as marble. I own the company, a company with offices in New York, London, and Singapore. A company that has quietly become one of the most sought-after design firms in the world for sustainable and innovative architecture. I chose to keep a low profile. I find it filters my interactions. It allows me to see people for who they truly are, not how they react to the presence of wealth. His gaze rested on Chloe, a silent, pointed message. He wasn't finished. He reached into the portfolio again. This time he produced a thick, bound document, a prospectus. "And I didn't lose my job," he said, placing the prospectus on top of the other documents. "2 weeks ago, I finalized the sale of a 60% majority stake in Helios Designs to Omnicorp, the global development conglomerate. The deal has been in the works for over a year." He opened the prospectus to the final page, the summary of acquisition. He turned it so they could all see the final number. It was long. It had a lot of zeros. A staggering, life-altering, world-shattering number. 9 figures. "I didn't lose my job," Ethan repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each word a hammer blow. "I sold my company for a sum that would make your entire net worth, Robert, look like a rounding error. I have not been spending the last 2 weeks looking for work. I have been overseeing the final transfer of $250 million into my private holding company." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a universe being unmade. The confident, condescending world of Eleanor and Robert deconstructed in a matter of seconds. Robert's face had gone from a blotchy red to a pasty, sickly white. He looked at the number on the page, then at Ethan, his mouth hanging slightly open. Eleanor was frozen. Her perfectly constructed mask of superiority had shattered, revealing the grasping, terrified snob beneath. Her eyes darted from the documents to Ethan's face, unable to process the reality of what she was seeing. This quiet, simple man she had disdained and dismissed for 5 years was not just wealthy. He was on a level of wealth she could only dream of. He was the titan of industry she had always wanted for her daughter, and she had treated him like dirt. And Chloe looked like she had been struck by lightning. She was staring at Ethan as if he were a complete stranger. The man she had married, the man she had just discarded as pathetic, was an illusion. And the reality was something so far beyond her comprehension that she couldn't even form a word. The foundation of her entire life, her entire value system, had just been vaporized. "So," Ethan said, his voice slicing through the stunned silence. He gestured to the pile of documents on the table. "Now that we have a more accurate picture of my financial situation, let's return to your proposal. You were suggesting we sell the house to provide me with some liquidity. Is that still your recommendation?" He looked directly at Robert, who flinched as if he'd been physically struck. "And you, Eleanor," Ethan continued, his gaze relentless, "you were concerned about Chloe's standard of living. You wanted to secure a fundraising job for her at the museum. I have to ask, do you still think that's necessary?" The reversal was complete. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with cataclysmic force. The judges had become the judged. The condescending elite were now the pleading, terrified subjects of a king they had mistaken for a pauper. The quiet man they had sought to humiliate now held their entire world in the palm of his hand, and he was closing his fist. The first sound to break the crushing silence was a choked, strangled gasp from Eleanor. She looked at the documents on the table, then at Ethan, and a grotesque transformation took place. The sneering contempt in her eyes was replaced by a frantic, desperate avarice. She saw not the man she had wronged, but the fortune she had almost let slip through her daughter's fingers. "Ethan," she breathed, her voice suddenly slick with a horrifying, sycophantic warmth. I had no idea. We had no idea. This is wonderful news. We always knew you were brilliant. We always said it." The lie was so bald, so audacious, that it was almost impressive. Robert, recovering his senses, quickly followed his wife's lead. He stood up, his face flushed with a forced, jovial bonhomie. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. My boy, you kept this quiet, a masterstroke. Knew you had it in you. That's that decisiveness I was talking about. He slapped his own knee, laughing a booming, false laugh that echoed unnervingly in the tense room. He was trying to rewrite the last 5 years in a single, desperate moment, to reposition himself from antagonist to proud father-in-law. Ethan watched them, his expression one of cold, clinical disgust. He didn't even grace them with a response. He simply turned his gaze to Chloe. She was still frozen in her chair, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, horrifying understanding. The man she had dismissed was gone. In his place was this powerful, formidable stranger who had been observing her, testing her, and had found her utterly wanting. The shame was a visible tide, rising from her neck to her cheeks. "Chloe?" Ethan said, his voice soft again, but this time the softness was a weapon. It cut through her paralysis. I don't... Why?" she stammered, the words barely a whisper. "Why wouldn't you tell me?" The question was an accusation, a desperate attempt to shift the blame onto him, to frame his secrecy as the transgression, not her betrayal. Ethan's face hardened. "Why? You're asking me why? Look at them, Chloe." He gestured with his chin toward her parents, who were now beaming at him with the intensity of wolves who had just stumbled upon an unguarded flock. "That is why. I saw this in them from the very first day. This obsession with status, with wealth, with appearances. I saw that they measured a person's worth by their bank statement. I just didn't know if you did too." He took a step toward her. "I wanted a partner, a wife who loved me, Ethan Crane, the man who loves the poetry of architecture and makes you chamomile tea when you're stressed. I didn't want a wife who loved Helios designs and the man who could buy her a trip to Monaco. I kept my work private because I wanted something real. I was testing the foundation of our marriage, Chloe. I was waiting for the moment I could trust you with the whole truth about me." He let the words hang in the air. "The night I told you I lost my job was that test. I gave you a choice. Stand with the man you married in what you believe was his darkest hour, or run to the security of your parents' world. You didn't even hesitate." The tears were now streaming freely down Chloe's face. "I love you," she sobbed, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "I do love you, Ethan. I was scared. I was foolish. I listened to them, but I love you." "Do you?" Ethan asked, his voice devoid of malice, filled only with a deep, bottomless sadness. "Or do you love what I can give you? Did you love me 2 weeks ago, when you called me pathetic? Did you love me when you were discussing with your mother how this was a blessing in disguise? When did the love come back, Chloe? Was it when you saw the number on that acquisition summary?" The question was brutal, a surgeon's cut straight to the heart of the matter. It was the moral mirror, and the reflection it showed her was ugly and undeniable. She had no answer. She just wept, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. Eleanor, seeing her daughter falter, stepped forward, her hands outstretched in a gesture of pleading. "Ethan, please, she's young. She made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but she loves you. We can fix this. The family can be stronger than ever now. This is a new beginning for all of us." Ethan finally looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes made her physically recoil. "There is no us, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "There is no family. There is just you and your greed, and the daughter you have molded in your own image. You have never been my family. You have been a parasite, and I have been your host. But the hosting arrangement is now terminated." He turned back to Chloe, his expression softening slightly. "As for the house, there will be no sale. As my lawyer can and will confirm, this property is owned by a trust I established long before our marriage. You have no legal claim to it. You have been living here as my guest." he paused, "and your invitation has expired." The finality in his voice was absolute. He was not just ending an argument, he was ending a life. The life they had all taken for granted. "You have until the end of the week to remove your belongings," he said to Chloe, his voice now purely logistical. "I will have a cashier's check for $5 million delivered to you. Consider it a severance package. It should be enough for you to live comfortably, though perhaps not at the standard to which you've become accustomed." He then looked at Eleanor and Robert. "As for you two, I suggest you leave my house now. If you ever attempt to contact me or come onto my property again, I will enforce the restraining order Marcus has already prepared. Your access to my life and my resources is now permanently severed." He bent down and calmly began to gather the documents from the coffee table, sliding them back into his leather portfolio. The meeting was over. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence had been passed. The room was filled with the sound of a world ending and the quiet, deliberate zip of a leather portfolio closing. The aftermath was a symphony of desperation. Robert, the portly and passive patriarch, was the first to break completely. He sank back onto the sofa, his face ashen, looking as though he might have a heart attack. He had just witnessed a man he considered his inferior dismantle his entire reality, and then effortlessly write a check for a sum that dwarfed his own hard-won, boast-worthy fortune. He was a small man, and he had never felt smaller. Eleanor, however, was made of sterner, more venomous stuff. Her panic quickly curdled into rage. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "She is your wife. You have a duty to her, to this family, after everything we've done for you." Ethan, who was walking towards the front door to open it for them, stopped and turned back slowly. He almost laughed, but the sound that escaped was dry and humorless. "Everything you've done for me? You have done nothing for me, Eleanor. You have done things to me. You have insulted me, belittled me, and plotted against me. You have actively tried to destroy my marriage. The only thing you have done is reveal my wife's character to me, and for that, I suppose I should thank you. It's been an expensive, but invaluable, lesson." He opened the front door, letting the cool night air rush into the overheated room. "Goodbye, Eleanor." She stared at him, her chest heaving, her mind racing for another angle, another piece of leverage. But she had none. She had built her entire strategy on the assumption of his weakness, and his strength was so absolute, so total, that it left her with no ground to stand on. Defeated, she grabbed Robert's arm, pulling him to his feet. With a final hateful glare at Ethan, she steered her dazed husband out of the house and into the darkness. Now only Chloe remained. She was still in the armchair, huddled into herself, looking small and broken. The sobs had subsided into quiet, hitched breaths. Ethan closed the door, the soft click of the latch sealing them inside the wreckage of their marriage. He walked back and stood before her, not in anger, but with the weary sadness of a man surveying irreparable damage. "You have a choice to make, Chloe," he said, his voice much softer now that her parents were gone. "But it's not the one you think." She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "A choice? The check I mentioned, the $5 million, that's yours no matter what. It's not a weapon, it's a provision. I made a commitment to you, and I will honor the part of it that I can, which is to ensure you are never in financial distress." He crouched down so he was at her eye level. It was an act of intimacy that felt profoundly alien after the night's events. "Your choice is not about money," he continued. "It's about your soul. You can take that money and go back to them. You can live the life they always wanted for you. You can find your Julian, buy your house in the Hamptons, and spend the rest of your life chasing status. You will be wealthy and comfortable, and you will be empty, because you will always know that you failed the one test of character that ever truly mattered." He paused, his gaze intense. "Or there is another path, a harder one. You can walk out that door and not go to them. You can cut them off, not for me, but for you. You can take the money I'm giving you and use it to build a life of your own, on your own terms. You can find out who Chloe Crane is without her mother's voice in her ear. You can try to become a person of substance, not just style, a person who values integrity over invitations. She stared at him, hope flickering in her eyes. And if I do that, is there a chance for us? Ethan's face was a mask of sorrow. He reached out and for a moment almost touched her cheek, but let his hand fall. No, he said gently, but with devastating finality. There is no us anymore. You broke that. You broke my trust and my heart in a way that can't be repaired. The man who loved you, the man who would have forgiven you almost anything, died in the hallway outside our bedroom door 2 weeks ago. I am what's left, and what's left knows he can never, ever trust you again. The flicker of hope in her eyes died, and the truth of her loss finally landed with its full, crushing weight. It wasn't just the money she had misjudged. It was the man. She had traded a great love for the promise of a mediocre fortune, only to discover the man she discarded possessed both. And now, she had neither. The divorce papers will be sent to you wherever you choose to go, Ethan said, standing up. Marcus will handle everything. I wish you well, Chloe. I truly hope you find your way. He turned and walked away, heading toward the staircase that led to his office, his sanctuary. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Chloe sat alone in the vast, silent living room for a long time. The house, which had once felt like a symbol of her success, now felt like a mausoleum. Every beautiful object was a testament to the man she never knew and the love she had so carelessly thrown away. Eventually, she stood up on shaky legs. She walked to the front door, her movements stiff and robotic. She opened it and stepped outside, not knowing where she was going, only knowing that she could not go back. The choice was hers to make, in the cold and unforgiving darkness. 3 months later, the first snow of the season was falling on the city. Ethan stood behind a pane of glass on the 40th floor of a new building, watching the flakes drift down and melt against the warm windows. He wasn't in his old house. He had sold it. The memories were too toxic, the space too full of ghosts. He had donated a significant portion of the proceeds to a foundation that built shelters for the homeless. He now lived in a penthouse apartment in the city, a place he was slowly making his own. The door to the conference room opened, and Marcus walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The board is ecstatic, Marcus said, handing a cup to Ethan. Your vision for the new philanthropic wing, the Helios Foundation for Urban Renewal, was approved unanimously. They've seeded it with an initial $100 million. Ethan smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Good. We can get to work then. That housing project in the Bronx needs to be our first priority. He had thrown himself into his work, but it was a different kind of work now. With his seat on the OmniCorp board and his newfound public profile, he was leveraging his name and fortune to pursue the projects he had always dreamed of. Architecture that served communities, that healed urban blight, that elevated the human spirit in a real, tangible way. He was no longer hiding. He was building in the light. Any news? Ethan asked, his voice casual, though it was a question he asked every time he saw Marcus. Marcus knew who he meant. Some, he said carefully. The divorce is final, as you know. The funds were transferred. She didn't contest anything. And? She didn't go back to Greenwich, Marcus said. Ethan's shoulders relaxed a fraction of an inch. According to my sources, she hasn't spoken to her parents since that night. They've been trying to reach her, desperately, but she's refused all contact. Where is she? Ethan asked, his voice quiet. She rented a small apartment in Brooklyn. She enrolled in a master's program, social work. Ethan turned from the window, surprised. Social work? Marcus nodded. It seems she took your advice. She's trying to find out who she is, or build someone new. Ethan was silent for a long moment, processing this. There was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction, just a deep, lingering melancholy. A part of him was relieved, even proud that she had chosen the harder path. But it didn't change anything. The damage was done. A beautiful, intricate structure had been condemned, and all you could do was salvage what materials you could and build something new on a different site. "And Eleanor and Robert?" Ethan asked. Marcus allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Their world has crumbled. Turns out a lot of their social and financial standing was built on Robert's perceived closeness to certain influential people. People who are now on your board of directors. When word got out about how they treated you, the invitations stopped coming. Robert's business partners are distancing themselves. They're being ostracized. Poetic justice, I suppose. The status they worshipped was their undoing." Ethan nodded slowly. He felt nothing. Their fate was a distant echo, a problem in a world he no longer inhabited. His world was here, in this room, with blueprints for a better future spread across the table. He had learned a hard lesson. True worth is not in what you own, but in who you are when no one is looking. Integrity is a foundation that cannot be shaken. And love, real love, must be strong enough to withstand the storms of pride and prejudice. His had not been, or rather, hers had not. He would carry the scars of that failure, but they were no longer open wounds. They were part of the design of the man he had become, stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to building things that last. As he looked out at the snow-covered city, a landscape of infinite possibility, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The past was a closed chapter, a story that had been told. A new one was waiting to be written. This story is a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that a person's true character is revealed not in times of comfort, but in times of crisis. Ethan's journey from quiet endurance to righteous revelation forces us to ask ourselves what we truly value in our relationships. Is it status and security, or is it integrity, loyalty, and love? He gave his wife a test, and her failure was a tragedy that ultimately set him free. What do you think? Did Chloe deserve the second chance she asked for, or was Ethan right to walk away forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. If this story resonated with you, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to our channel for more content that explores the complexities of the human heart. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.